Welcome to the Block and Tackle Show, hosted by Carl Block. Carl is a partner in the law firm of Loeb & Loeb here in Los Angeles, California. He will be tackling some of the biggest issues in business today. Listen, learn, and enjoy as he leaves no stone unturned during deep conversations with some of today's most amazing business leaders. Welcome to the show. Carl Block is both a corporate lawyer and a corporate restructuring partner in the Los Angeles office of Loeb & Loeb LLP. Nothing in the podcast should be construed as legal advice. To the extent legal issues are discussed, please consult an attorney if you have any questions or need advice relating to the matters discussed. This podcast may constitute attorney advertising in certain jurisdictions. The views expressed in the podcast are not necessarily the views of Loeb & Loeb or Carl Block. Carl and each guest reserves the right to change any opinions that may be expressed on the show and disagree with what others say, even if such disagreement is not expressed during the podcast.
Let me just ask you this. Can we turn to South America? And maybe I should back up and say that you regularly post about inflation and the value of currencies on your X account. And I don't think that most people actually appreciate the depth of what you look at with African countries, Asian countries, South American countries, and their currencies. And also, I would imagine you would say for a lot of these countries, one of the big reasons why they got their economic policies wrong was their monetary policy. And they just did what they did without regard to the consequences. When you have these countries which are irresponsible with their monetary policy, and then they have a real runaway train, they then have to go to the hypersonic inflation killer, that's you, to help them figure out what to do. And I know that you're active now in South America and not for the first time. Can we talk about Venezuela for a second? How have they survived this whole time being as, what I think people would say is as imprudent as they have been?
Well, that's not well. You know, you've got a quarter of the population who's actually left Venezuela. I mean, and the poverty rate has gone skyrocketing. We've had Maduro in power for a decade, and before that we had Chavez, and the policy, they call it Chavismo, but it's an interventionist socialist kind of set of policies. And at present in Venezuela, they have an inflation rate that I measure at 349% per year today. I just measured it. So let's say 350% per year. The money supply, of course, you say, well, isn't all this connected to monetary policy? Yes, it is. The money supply is growing at 421% per year, M3 in Venezuela. So it's always the same game. Change the money supply a lot, and you get lots of changes in economic activity, asset prices, and inflation eventually. And that's, of course, exactly what we've had. And since January of 2022, the Venezuelan bolivar has lost 86% of its value against the US dollar. So that's why the country is more or less spontaneously dollarized. People don't want the bolivar. They get rid of the thing like a hot potato and get US dollars. So that's the nub of the economic problem comes out. You can see it. And the best way to keep the pulse on a country is look at what's happening to their money supply, look what's happening to the inflation rate, look what's happening to the exchange rate. And, you know, with those three things, you pretty much have a good gauge of things. That's why I watch them.
Understood. But you have immense poverty because poor people, as you've previously said, they're basically taxed, and they're taxed by inflation. So, you know, they can't afford to eat. They can't afford basic essentials. And their survival is almost at stake. But the wealthy and the people who are attached to the administrations of these irresponsible governments, they have assets. So when there's inflation, they're doing okay. But you have this chasm that I'm not even sure I know how people can relate to or describe if they haven't seen it. But when you're dealing with a 350% inflation rate year over year, what can be done? I mean, that sounds so incredibly dire. How do you get back to monetary sanity and rebuild an economy?
Well, I think the thing I've been recommending, because I am the chief advisor of a presidential candidate right now. Roberto Enrique is a presidential candidate running in the Christian Democratic Party under that flag. And I propose that they do exactly what we did in Bulgaria in 1997. We installed a currency board, and a currency board in Venezuela would do what it did in Bulgaria. It would smash inflation immediately. Bulgaria, the inflation was a lot higher than Venezuela, by the way. It was 242% per month,
Wow.
not per year. It's about 250% per year. About 350% per year. 350% per year in Venezuela. It was 242% per month in Bulgaria. And we put the currency board in July 1st of 1997, and within a month, the inflation rate was down in single digits. So what is the currency board? What would it be? And what it is, and what Enrique calls Plan Hanke, is the bolivar would be issued. It would trade at a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar and be freely convertible, and it would be backed 100% with US dollar reserves. So it would be, the bolivar would just be a clone of the US dollar. It would be as good as the US dollar. If you didn't like it, you'd go in and exchange the bolivar at a fixed exchange rate for US dollars, and you would know with 100% certainty that you were going to get US dollars, because the requirement of the currency board is that 100% reserve cover is backs the bolivars that are being issued. So that would be the solution if Roberto Enrique wins. We'll have a currency board, and that'll be the end in Venezuela. That'll be the end of the inflation and the end of the depreciating bolivar. And with that, we'll have stability, and then start doing other things.
Who would be on that currency board?
Well, usually most members of the currency board, boards of directors, are in-country people. I think ideally I would prefer to see a five-member board with two of them being in-country. Two would be from Venezuela, and three would be from outside of Venezuela, and not from any neighboring countries.
To what degree would they need cooperation to make this work? Would they need the cooperation of the United States?
Oh, the U.S. is irrelevant, because the country is already dollarized unofficially, and the U.S. doesn't have anything to say about it. Countries that are dollarized, that have the dollar as the anchor for a currency board, like Hong Kong, the U.S. had no part in that whatsoever. To do this, you do not have to get the approval of the U.S. government because you're using the US dollar as a reserve currency or anchor for a currency board.
That makes sense. So, turning to at least one other country in South America that you've studied and you've been involved in before was Argentina, which I don't know who's worse in terms of monetary policy and lack of discipline. But what do you see happening in Argentina in terms of dollarization?
Well, one of the presidential candidates is Javier Milei is actually proposing official dollarization in Argentina. It's something that I recommended when I was advising President Menem way back in 1999, what should they do? And I said dollarize. So I did draft up at that time with Dr. Kurt Schuler a draft dollarization law. This was back in 1999. And unfortunately, Menem didn't pull a trigger and do it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the pickle that they're in right now. Right now, the money supply is growing at 99% per year. And of course, what do we have? I measured inflation today, 167% in Argentina. So dollarization, which by the way, I've done in Montenegro in 1999 and also was part of the dollarization process in Ecuador in 2000. And it would smash the inflation immediately. You would moth the central bank and the peso and put them in museums, and you'd replace the peso with the US dollar. And when you do that, you would put a hard budget constraint in the system, just like you would with a currency board, in the sense that the monetary authority could not extend credit or create credit and loan money to the government to finance the government. So it would work like a charm.
Do you think that the contagion, or there is a contagion with these two countries spreading to the rest of South America, and then those countries in turn also then needing your help?
It isn't really contagion in that sense. There could be a copycat kind of effect, but all of Latin America, the problem is they have a tendency to go for populist politicians, and along with the populism usually comes an unleashing of the printing presses and increases in the money supply. And once you get that, you get inflation. So, and as I say, it varies. Right now, of course, inflation's under control in the three countries that are dollarized, which Panama has been dollarized for over 100 years and has no problems. And Ecuador doesn't have an inflation problem, and also you don't have that inflation problem in El Salvador, which is also dollarized since 2001. So I think all of the Latin American countries, at least most of them, should actually be dollarized officially. Most of them are unofficially dollarized. The dollar really is the coin of the realm. I mean, what do people have in their safety deposit boxes? They have dollars.
No, I understand. I just wonder, when these countries are late to the party, or they're resistant, or as you say, the printing presses are unleashed, it doesn't necessarily affect them in isolation. For example, when we were talking about a quarter of the population of Venezuela leaving their country, they didn't get on boats and they're just living offshore. They're migrating to other countries, including this country. And they're creating economic and logistical challenges for us, let alone the issues with trade and our reluctance to do foreign investment in these countries, and other countries doing foreign investment in these countries in the absence of stability. So it seems like, one way or another, more developed countries end up paying for the mistakes of some of these other countries.
Oh, yeah. In that sense, you're exactly right. I mean, if a pin drops someplace, or some ripple in the international economy, whether it's big or small, that goes through the system. So you've just outlined some that are associated with these more or less dysfunctional economies. Venezuela, of course, being a kind of extreme case, but all of them they have central banks, and central banks are destabilizers. Most people think, they read an economics textbook and they say, oh, the central bank is there. It can fine tune the economy, smooth out business cycles, and so forth and so on. No, central banks in most developing countries actually destabilize the situation. They'd all be better off if they just dumped the central banks and adopted some stable foreign currency, or made their local currency a clone of some stable foreign currency by putting in a currency board. It's central banking is what really is a big destabilizer. And as a result of that, as you point out, it spills over outside the borders one way or another, either with economic trade, with migration. These aren't autarkies that are sealed off with no connection to the outside world. They are connected to the outside world.
Do you see, I mean, you'd agree with the idea that when central banks were created, they had good motivation. They were done, or good intentions. They were done for a good reason, but in practice, they seem to enable the bad behaviors of their correspondent governments. And we run into problems like this. And I wonder if there's a possible way to reform central banks and central bank behavior so as not to just be devoid of them in modern economies.
Well, I'm not so certain that you do need central banks, but in any case, you have to look at institutions, how they actually run. And we have a long record of central banking in developing countries, and the record is one of complete disaster. It started really big after World War II, because at that point in time, there were lots of currency boards and currency stability, monetary stability, and so forth. Then we had really three things going on. We had decolonization. This is particularly in Africa, and of course, the newly independent countries wanted to trash everything that was connected with colonialism. And one thing that was viewed as a colonial institution were currency boards. So the idea was get rid of the currency board, that's colonial, and put in a central bank. The second aspect of that was that at that time, Keynesian economics was really coming to the fore, and that suggested that if you had one way to fine-tune the economy and smooth out business cycles and mitigate from economic shocks and things like that was to have a central bank. So that was the second thing that encouraged central banking. And then the third thing was the fact that you just had the IMF and the World Bank were just formed as a result of post-World War II invention, really. And those organizations really needed jobs for the boys. And what better institution than a central bank in some African country where they'd had a currency board that operated perfectly. All of a sudden, they want a central bank because it's Keynesian, fine-tuning, it's anti-colonial, and no one there knew how to run a central bank. So you needed lots of technical assistance from the IMF and the World Bank to show the locals how to run a central bank. So you had those three things going for central banking. But as I say, it turned out to be a disaster because the performance after the introduction of central banking is much worse than the performance prior to.
Well, I look forward to hearing about what consulting you may be doing in Latin America and potentially other places. And I've been grateful to have this conversation with you. I would just like to ask, before we close, one more question about the US. And that would be, where do we go from here? And we've talked about how incredible the deficit spending is and how the national debt is increasing and what the interest on that debt is. Where do you see the next 18 months going in terms of monetary policy and what will happen with the economy?
Well, the next 6 to 18 months is pretty easy. I think we're going to have a pretty good recession because the monetary policy has been extremely tight now for over a year, and the money supply is actually contracting at a negative 3.7% per year, unprecedented contraction. And to hit the inflation target, the Fed should be growing the money supply at around 6% per year. So that negative 3.7 is a long way below, far away from what I call the golden growth rate. And I think a recession is just baked in the cake. If you look at 2024, well, I think we're going to see a recession.
Okay, well, thank you for coming, and I look forward to having you back in the future. Thanks again, Steve.
Great to be with you, Carl.
Thanks for tuning in. If you want more info on the show, please visit blockandtackleshow.com. And you can also email me at carl@blockandtackleshow.com. Thanks for tuning in.